who are you?
I'm Sam Leve, and I'm a role-playing performer and variety streamer for Twitch. That is to say that I work in studios and online to play role-playing games in a manner that tells an overarching story using game mechanics. We call it dramatic improv structured by dice.
What are the 3 things you value most in life?
As I'm marinating, it's an interesting question in itself because there's material or abstract. You can always give an answer of, a phone machine, or an answer like liberty. 2 things I value most, I think, are interrelated. That is to say, I value novelty of thought in new projects and creativity. I enjoy being surprised. I'll see that in storytelling, a twist that I didn't see coming. I see it in my own field, in game design, something unusual or unexpected, something that will advance the medium. And likewise, I value competence of execution. In any field of design, that means effectively building toward that vision that ideally is novel in some way, but equally a beautifully structured screenplay. There's something very satisfying for me of something that is done well within its scope, not only because it speaks to the skill and craft of the person doing it, but that person was able to conceive of a goal that they knew was in their competence to reach. Not only did they hit the mark, but they probably knew that they could when they picked the mark they were shooting toward in the first place. But the third, less directly related, is generosity of spirit. In my field, in an improvisational, collaborative storytelling medium, it is valuable above all to uplift one's collaborators in a circle that passes around. If I help my fellow players tell their story, then they can help me and I can help someone else down the line. That when I look at, for instance, what makes a great role player, always it comes down to different ways of helping other people to accomplish what they're looking to do. It not only makes better stories in that medium, because you're not doing your own heavy lifting, you're naturally a part of the story because someone else has tied you in, but it also is a matter of empathy. At a role-playing table, we're in the middle of a moment, always, and we endeavor to push a story forward, always, and as much as possible to stay in that story. And so, in any of these games, there will be a secondary layer of unspoken communication, implied by what actions you take, what scenes you put forth. Any suggestion is effectively a pitch. There's a whole writer's room going on underneath any role-playing game. And part of being good in a writer's room is the same thing as being in that second layer of conversation in my field, that you listen to the pitches that are taken in, that you build with them. And that all requires putting aside a level of ego and focusing outwardly. And that makes for good collaborators, empathetic collaborators, and ultimately results in, well, excellence of execution.
Tell me a memory which shaped you.
A lot of folks might know that I'm queer. And for some queer folks, that is a revelation that happens late in life. For some people, we pretty much couldn't hide it from a very young age, and I myself was the latter category. I was one of the few kids out in my school from middle school, and it's strangely not too long ago that period in my life was contemporaneous to, in the United States politic, proposing and discussing constitutional amendments about whether people like me should be forbidden from marriage. That, as lovely as it has been to see greater support for queer youth now, I'm very aware of how far we've come in even just a little time, cognizant of how far we are left to go. And so when I was in 9th grade, in my first year of high school, I was expelled from one of the most prestigious preparatory academies in Los Angeles. And in my mom's meeting with the deans of that school, it was revealed that it was no small part, indeed in large part, because I was openly gay. I was an absolute dyed-in-the-wool academic. Hermione Granger was the most relatable character I had ever read. And I had wanted to go to this academy for years, specifically because it was the best academic education I could have access to, that it would open up a whole line of prestige. From there, you go to an Ivy League school, you go on and such, and very much fulfill all of the rubrics of a vision of success. And when I was expelled from that school, that shattered for me. And it is so powerful because I had to build myself up from that. From not just the trauma of expulsion, but from rebuilding what a life might look like. That in failing, in some sense, this perfect, societally determined academic rubric, I had to find something to replace it. And what happened in that place was going to a public high school for the arts, not academics. I went to a high school to study opera, of all things, as high schoolers do. And it was a great education. It certainly did not fit a predetermined life path. And not just any particular memory, but the experience of that kind of failure turned to a different shape of triumph has stuck with me throughout, because now I find myself in a career that 9th grader could never have conceived of. This did not exist back then, and it certainly did not fit into any life plan I might have had for myself. And the experience of having to throw it all out and build something new, not externally determined, but motivated by what brought me joy, is something that's informed all of my life since. And fortunately, that itself came with a certain sort of happy ending. I might have been expelled from that prestigious academy for being gay, but I went to art school. How queer do you think that place was?
Oh, there's a saying which kind of, it was knocking about in my head in the middle of that. The thing about eating shit is that there's no shit left after you've done it. So, we've predetermined in our society that failure means you are a bad person. You fail, you suck. You fail because you suck. That's why things like Picard's famous saying of like, you can do everything right and still fail. That's not on you. That's life. That's why that resonates with people so much. But in reality, failure is just a thing that happens. It's not necessarily anything you can control. Sometimes it is. What you can control is how you react to it. That is where the building of character comes in. Because my major enemy in my life has been myself. Has been my own mental health. Has been how precisely with your own ideas and words and concepts and expectations can you harm yourself. And yet, without those things, I would never have come to many of the realizations and have been braver for it, have been catalyzed in the fire of my own mentality. And so hearing that is deeply, deeply inspiring. What's your favourite colour?
Teal. My favourite colour is teal.
Why?
I like cool colours. Broadly speaking, not cool as in hip, but cool as in low temperature. And usually teals are very saturated, and that has its own sort of aesthetic appeal to me. But I likewise grew up just a few blocks from the ocean, so I imagine there's a little bit of a nostalgic factor there.
Tell me in as much detail as you can about something you knew of which once existed and now does not.
I was 12 years old when I got my diver's license. That's divers, mind you, and not drivers. And one trait of scuba diving that at least I've experienced is that when you resurface, you are absolutely ravenous. And so in that process and in the heat of the place where I was learning, I found myself very often returning to a soft serve station. One thing that used to exist but now does not is that cone of vanilla soft serve that I would go for immediately after a dive. It was probably too sweet to my taste now, but perfect then, both in the ice cream itself and in the cone, a waffle cone that had not too much crisp to it. It was just a little sogged from the humidity of the place I was in. It was soft without melting somehow, which is a trait I didn't fully understand that ice cream could have. And it tasted not just like it had heard of the concept of vanilla, but that it had in fact internalized it and had a flavor to it. So often we associate vanilla with being bland, but in fact it is spicy and rich and thorough, and the notion that any flavor like that could come from a machine was itself pretty radical. Our sensory experiences are intrinsically ephemeral, and things like food even more so. Not only could I surely never find that soft serve machine again, it wouldn't taste the same, not due to any ingredients, but due to my own change and the flavor by hunger of coming from a dive, and all of the attendant experiences that informed not just that soft serve, but the experience of eating it.
Question 6. What, if anything, is perfect?
There's an almost brittle quality to the idea of perfection because it precludes change almost. To be perfect means nothing could make it better. And that means perhaps that perfection can only exist within a certain set of circumstances or respect to a given evaluation in a given moment, perhaps. Like a soft serve. But in fact, circumstances themselves are never perfect, never allowing for the uplift of something into perfection, into an unchanging state whereby nothing could be better about it. That if I were to name a perfect movie, by my own evaluation in this moment, it is going to be a troubling historical document in a few hundred years, not because anything about it changed, but because the circumstances did, and so how then could it truly be called perfect? A perfect thing is perhaps not even something to strive for, because it requires impossibility, and asking impossibility does not always produce what is best from ourselves. What I would look for always is for something to have arete, to be a good thing of its kind, to be well produced, well executed.
Who is your favourite character from fiction of any kind, and why?
A favorite character is so different from a best character that a favorite can be by any subjective circumstance. So mine is Furiosa from Mad Max. Now, that is a movie and a character whom I can defend on aesthetic benefits alone, but she is my favorite because of what she and that movie evoked from me and the experience that I had with that film. I'd never really been a big fan of action films. They were fine, I guess. They're pretty cool. They have big explosions and that's rad, but I had never connected to the heart of them. And in watching Mad Max Fury Road, Furiosa was a vehicle by which I could experience, frankly, what I think men watching action films had experienced for all time. That watching that protagonist advance story and do the incredible things that we're so used to seeing action stars do, but from a disabled female character, blew my mind in a way that I was not fully prepared to contemplate, but simply having her there grounded me in an action movie story and allowed me to experience all of those tropes of action movies from a new light. All of those explosions were more exciting because I felt the peril. I cared a little more about the stakes. And yes, assuredly, that is because Mad Max Fury Road is a painstakingly constructed movie. And so merely to be a character in that movie is to be set up for success, in effect. But a character who is relentless, is self-driven, ironically from a car movie, who does not shy from doing what she needs to do, not as societally determined, but as determined by her own guiding compass, to abandon a relatively privileged, safe position in a very dangerous society, to save others who had been in what we understand to be her former circumstances. And that is perhaps an undersung element of a badass character. It's not just that she is badass, though unquestionably she is. But that she is an object lesson in a way of a thing I think many of us need to learn, which is not to pull the ladder up behind us. The implications of that story suggest that Furiosa was in something not wholly unlike the position where we find the wives in that movie. And when we see her, she is now an imperator. She has one of the few powerful positions that we see a woman in. Powerful by that masculine conception of politic. Powerful within Immortan Joe's corrupt society. And when any of us climbs our way out, it can be all too tempting to hang on to safety precisely because the alternative is so perilous. What showcases Furiosa's true bravery for me is not the physical danger that she puts herself in, but that she does it for others in a way that endangered her own position. And I think anyone who finds themselves in a position of relative power can take note from that. That especially if you are marginalized along one axis, it can be tempting to hang on to whatever you've got and to fend off any threats to that little ledge to cling to. And Furiosa does not. Furiosa abandons a position of privilege in an unjust society to save others and ultimately to build a new one by tearing down that very thing that uplifted her. And to be accompanied by a flamethrower guitar solo, yes, that is absolutely excellent. It is but the wrapper for a deeper story about a character who showcases what I would consider true bravery.
My favorite thing about the Mad Max series is that the entire thing is framed as campsite fires by the apocalypse. Like, a scared child is, like, cooing to their mother, and the mother's like, oh, but if we get in trouble, well, have you ever heard the tale of Mad Max? And it's like, yeah, tell it again, you know? I absolutely adore it, and that's why I didn't find the change of actors or anything like that jarring, because these are just apocalypse stories, and I love Mad Max for that. It's interesting that you mentioned that point about experiencing classic tropes for a new perspective because of a character that you could actually relate to. Because I'm currently playing through The Last of Us 2. I'm about halfway through. I just finished Ellie's section of the game. And Last of Us 1 was fine. It was okay. It was fine. I didn't really care for Joel. He was a bit of an asshole. I didn't like him. Nothing about the story punched me in the way that everyone seemed to have been punched. Everyone spoke of this game with deep and humongous reverence, and I was just here like, what? The gunplay's a bit shit, isn't it? You know, and I suppose what had happened is I'd come from God of War before, and so you'll see around the time that I was playing this. Yeah, God of War. I had never felt a maternal connection to anything in my life, but I was convinced that if anyone touched Atreus, I would kill every single person in the entire world. If you touch my boy, you die. And so I'd come from this action-packed, you touch him, you die, here's an axe in your face, to, well, I'm kind of a milquetoast old man with at the start, of course, you get that big, and I'm not saying spoilers for a 10-year-old game at this point. The original, at the very start of The Last of Us, Joel loses his daughter, and that's kind of to set you up for the entire game, to explain why he's such an asshole. But to be honest, it didn't, in my head, bad things happening to you doesn't justify you doing bad things. And your circumstance can't justify you being an incredible dick for the majority of the game. I found the redemptive power of the ending to be quite powerful. which I won't spoil. But The Last of Us 2, bringing things from Ellie's perspective, made me experience this game in a way that I cannot describe, including the viscerality of it all. Like, The Last of Us 1 was a pretty visceral game, but having a moment where, as a character, you forget you're playing a game, and you smack a guy with a pipe, and you see, like, the viscera, and you physically go, oh my god, did I just do that? And then you see that his friend calls this guy's name, and you're like, I just killed Carl. I don't even know Carl. And then you have to justify in your head why you did that, even though you didn't do it. A character that you're interacting with did it. And it was just, I felt hollow watching Ellie's story unfold as it has been so far in the game, but I'm only halfway through. What fascinates you?
Game design fascinates me. It's one of the reasons why, in a career of hyperfocus and abandonment of interests that I've had throughout my life, games and game design have truly hooked me. The notion that not just creating rules to facilitate experiences that you have throughout games, but that in tabletop game design, the rules that you write, the systems that you set up, facilitate social experiences of a given kind. That a poorly crafted game can set friends against each other, not because there was intrinsic animosity, but because of the incentives and conflict between them, experienced by following the rules that you set up, by trying to be dutiful to those rules and obey them. They were put on some course of loggerheads, or conversely, that people who barely know each other or don't at all could make connections that last lifetimes. What kind of rules can do that? What are the principles behind engineering those experiences? How do you engineer the engineering? What do the good things have in common? How do you create different kinds of experiences with different kinds of rules? Because no single game is going to be perfect at everything. Not only because perfection does not exist, but because we seek different sorts of experiences, not just the satisfaction of social connection through narrative, but the puzzle challenge of optimizing a build in perhaps a more rules-driven or tactical game, of solving problems and puzzles presented by simulationist and advanced combat systems, that there are all sorts of different targets one could reach for. And game design for tabletop is such a young medium in creative media writ large. Games themselves are ancient beyond telling, but what we now think of as tabletop games are only a few decades old, really. Nothing of that looks like D&D existed before the late 70s. And so when you compare that to storytelling media that have been around for generations, we don't understand all of the interlocking gears nearly so well as we understand principles of screenwriting that have been collected over many more decades and that have been iterated upon and finessed so that there is, if not a science to creating a 90-minute movie, at least well understood pathways to soliciting particular responses and achieving certain ends. And by contrast, tabletop game design is still figuring it out. And that makes it an unsolved problem worth chewing on.
What is the most valuable thing you have ever learned?
I've learned that failure is not destructive, it is an inflection point. It is an impetus for change. I talked about it earlier in my own life in some ways, but that's only been reinforced by the kind of work that I do in tabletop gaming, where in large part success and failure will be determined totally externally to my decisions by these platonic solids and the mood they're in that day. And at first in gaming, it can be so tempting to want to win all the time at every step, as if like in a video game that we save scummed until if you were to go back and watch the canon run, the character never made any single mistake because any of those were wiped away. But it simply doesn't work that way in tabletop. Always there is some kind of randomizer or external factor where when your action is in doubt, there's a possibility of failure. And for many players, especially for emerging players, that's so deeply uncomfortable because it seems to speak to our character's competence. It seems to conflict with our vision of who we wanted this person to be. Just like in life, we feel like failure reflects upon the person who we are and makes us less. And what one quickly sees in tabletop is that failure is an opportunity for unexpected things. That yes, all of that frustration that you felt in this moment of the narrative not cohering to your expectations, that's good. That's surprise. You will make different decisions than you expected. And in so doing, you have the challenge of making those more interesting. Maybe a failure came at what seems like an inopportune moment, at a structurally wrong moment. And we could rage against the rolling of the dice, or we can set before ourselves the challenge of seeing what kind of well-structured arc would have a failure at this point. What kind of impetus for growth do you take from it? It's something I often feel as a challenge to my game master. Yes, I rolled a natural 1 on this where you expected me not to do it. What are you going to do now? How do you want to put an obstacle before me? Come at me. And so it is in that way a mutual challenge. And in settling into the realities of failure and in practicing through tabletop, finding opportunities for growth and revision of narrative, that's practice for failure in our own lives. That, honestly, that's true of so much of tabletop, that it is in some ways rehearsal for life. And of all of the lessons one can take from those games, for me, that which has been most valuable is not being frustrated at things not going according to my expectations, but finding ways that subversion will be interesting and useful and in fact move me forward.
If you could name a hot sauce, what would you call it and why?
This is too hot for you. Because so far as I can tell, as someone who doesn't myself eat terribly spicy food, some degree of it is something one can become used to, but I understand there's also a certain amount of escalation that occurs. And further, there's a sense of challenge to people consuming many hot sauces, particularly at the spicier levels. And therefore, were I to name a hot sauce, I would want it to be a dare. Because there are a good number of people who would go for it simply because they're told they shouldn't. And therefore, you should not have this hot sauce. It's too hot for you.
What is your most prized physical possession?
It seems strange even to call her a possession, but without doubt, the material object that matters most to me is my wheelchair. Her name is the Phoenix because she arose from the ashes of her fallen forebear when that chair was destroyed by an airline. I went over a month without a functioning chair. It would tilt and swerve like a shopping trolley going out of control. And that chair was precious to me and felt in that moment abandoned, almost betrayed for her to have broken. And thereafter, I got the Phoenix, whom I have been working with for the past 6 years, which is already a year beyond the traditional life cycle of a manual wheelchair, often replaced at about 5 years or so. And she's certainly gone through quite a lot. I had a short career as an integrated dancer. That is to say, I did contemporary dance with people with and without disabilities at a semi-professional level. She also participated alongside me in any number of ill-advised action sports. She's been on the pool deck with me. She's watched as I've played murder ball and WCMX and generally treated sidewalks and hills with a kind of callous disregard for safety, only because I know that I can trust her movement. Being wheeled allows one to experience physics in one's body in a wholly different way. Almost like when one has a magnet inserted into one's finger, as some body modders do, and then can feel magnetic currents around them, like a new sense. I'm sensitive to the slightest way that a sidewalk will be sloped so that water can run down, because I'll feel one arm working more to compensate. I'll feel the imperfect leveling of a house's foundation as I take my hands off the rims and feel not even where my chair is immediately rolling in some direction, but where she almost kind of wants to if I don't put hands on rims immediately. I can feel the weight of gravity in a slope, in a hill. I feel momentum, inertia, differently than I certainly ever did as a biped. And through all of this, the Phoenix facilitates joy in the Zoom. There's something I think that mountain bikers and skateboarders and anyone who is regularly on wheels in any manner has known, that sense of floating into speed and the perfect satisfaction of that speed in a way that legs only imperfectly replicate. It is to glide. And there's something about being in the moment of speed almost addictive, to want to continue it, to drive one's shoulders ragged just to maintain the momentum of it. And it is a joy that I think is wholly unknown to people outside the wheeling world who see only tragedy, who see incapability, who see nothing but loss. That is so bizarre to me, if only because it is so distant from my own experience, that how could anything that lets you fly be purely loss and tragedy and something to be avoided at all costs? That anyone who looks at wheelchairs that way, of being confined or bound, because I am not bound by a wheelchair except to the extent that I wear my seatbelt so that we might be even more intimately connected. That every movement, even a twitch of my hips into a turn, she will respond to. It is a partnership, not always a perfect one, that mistiming a wheelie can send you flying easily. That putting too heavy a backpack, she'll tip over the moment I get out. We joke all too often that the Phoenix is a tipsy chair, in part because she is set to be so exquisitely sensitive to my every movement. But movement as partnership is a unique and powerful experience, and so strange to have, so foreign to a non-disabled biped, to really feel a physical object as an extension of one's body, such that neuroplasticity has molded your movement around it. That is what movement feels like. That when we talk about chairs being extensions of ourselves, it is a centaur-like experience at times. Even though the next day it might feel totally foreign to you. We do not always have such perfect integration. Some days one gets into a chair and pushing feels familiar, but like some distant acquaintance that we're cautiously trying and awkwardly moving through. That elevates Phoenix for me far beyond being a material object or a possession that I own, even though in any reasonable definition she absolutely is.
You describe your wheelchair in the same way that I imagine that a starship pilot will describe their starship. And that is wonderful. What inspires you?
Inspiration for me is a fraught word, almost a poisoned word. It is a word that's often applied to disabled people to separate and reify them, and in so doing to use as a cudgel against anyone else who isn't doing it right. That inspiration porn is a long-used term in our community, and that, if anything, does disservice to pornography. And so, as a result, thinking of that which is inspiring to me first requires me to navigate this word, this concept that can often be a weapon wrapped in lace. Seemingly so attractive, but truly does harm. I should also take a moment to credit Stella Young as the inventor of the term inspiration porn. But taking it beyond how some mundane act when done by a disabled person is somehow inspirational when taken to the core of it. Inspirare, to draw breath. What elicits that response from me? And more importantly, what spurs me to do something? Inspires to what? Because that is what's always missing from toxic inspiration. It's all very well and good that you have seen this girl with cerebral palsy walk up the stairs, as was recently shared about on social media. What did that inspire you to? Did you do anything as a result of it? Or was this a sort of feel good for you, perhaps at someone else's expense? So, what inspires me is, cliche though it may be, the creativity of others, if only because I personally most enjoy creating in a collaborative environment, in building off of the work of others. In my training, in my operatic background, I'm not composing operas myself. I'm an interpreter. I'm putting my own spin on them. I am delving into the text, into the character, into the music, drawing what I can from that, making my own decisions about it, and then putting forth something new about it that hopefully says something new about that work. And that extends more broadly, I think, to how I have approached creativity in other media since. That I do not see myself necessarily as the composer of the proverbial opera, of the creation, but I draw inspiration from seeing what someone has done and then finding their vision in it, the core thing about it that is done excellently, that I have some response to, and building off of it in some way. Maybe in some circumstances, that's cannibalizing the things I like and remixing it into some other form of work. As I read the many RPG manuals that I have access to, I'm always looking for mechanics I find interesting that maybe in some piece I will steal and add to this and that and cook them together, and in so doing create something new. Or maybe it's hearing an idea from my game master that immediately gives me an idea of a character that I would want to have to interact with those story ideas. That, yes, cliche though it may be, the creativity of others is what inspires me, but I say that only because my work as a creative is to take and interpret and build and analyze and understand, which is itself an almost intellectual empathy at its best. And so when I say that creative inspires me, it's because it has inspired me to do and to build, and thereby, in a very different way, to create. It is reductive in that it reduces us to only those shared traits we have with people whose experiences can be used to harm us.
Hey, this is Editor Tess here, coming in to say that if you've noticed so far that there's some weird audio going on in this, it's because my audio just miraculously disappears at certain times during this recording, and I have no idea why. What you're missing here is about 15 minutes of a discussion on being trans and voices and stuff, and I say some pretty cool stuff, and Sam says some wonderful stuff, and I have all of Sam's recording, and I would just share it, but it seems kind of like if I do that, I'm presenting their opinion out of context. So I'm not going to do that, but needless to say, we both commiserated on the fact that gender identity is intrinsically linked to vocal sounding for some inexplicable and very silly reasoning. Because if you look at different cultures, different voices have different genders. But yeah, wish you could hear that, but you can't because my audio just doesn't exist. Anyway, back to the show. Did you ever have an epiphany? If so, what was it about?
Well, naturally, I had an epiphany when an angel appeared to me and said, wait, no, that's a literal one. In fact, I don't think I've had an epiphany, if only because so many realizations I've ever had are stepwise. That whenever I identify some candidate for epiphany, everything has been set up and foreshadowed, and the circumstances had to already exist for that moment of realization to happen. It's something we see in storytelling, that you can't truly whipsaw someone with surprise because it is rejected and unsatisfying. We decry it as a deus ex machina, for instance. That in order for something to truly stick, there has to already have been a groundwork laid. And so, epiphany in the sense of a realization, dramatic and paradigm altering and practically out of nowhere, is too distant from my own experience of gradualism. That each moment brings us to another, not teleologically, but in that those realizations couldn't have existed without already having context.
If you could say all of your work had a theme, what would that theme be?
All of my work is about the investigation of empathy. Not only how it exists and how it is expressed, but how it can be cultivated. Because so much of conflict comes from a lack of it. And so how can we make more? How can we spark that in someone else? Is it even possible? And if so, what does it? Because inspiration porn doesn't. Misery porn, likewise, doesn't. And I think particularly as marginalized people, there's this hunger to get people to understand. And it's so endlessly frustrating to so many of us because there's no tried and true formula. It is something we need so deeply. We need as people. And so many of us feel this hunger, this frustration of not knowing how. And so much of my work as a storyteller is then at least to show experiences from a light and from a direction of sympathies that an audience might not have seen. That so often experiences like mine are written from the outside in a certain way, as if written by and for people who haven't had those experiences, with the assumption that people haven't had them, that they're voyeuristic almost. And in that process, othering. It doesn't cultivate empathy. So some of my work is about portraying not voyeuristically, but from the inside in order to facilitate connection, because stories are incredibly powerful vehicles of empathy, that we can connect as human beings to even the simplest things. That Pixar's Up can have us red in the face and bawling in moments by creating connection, by creating empathy. And deconstructing that process seemed to me to be a key to accomplishing an end that I, as a person, so desperately wanted, which is to facilitate understanding, to create empathy. It is, in some ways, the social justice bard role that, because it is so important in my life, it has inevitably become reflected in my work in 1,000 different ways, in the toxicity and peril of failed empathy as a cautionary tale, to not didactic, but revelatory telling and recounting of experiences, not mine often, but motivated by similar circumstances or similar desires, or the transformative power of those moments when a person who didn't get it does. I know I was born with the genetic condition that I have, but I wasn't born disabled in that I didn't have impairments that obstructed my capacity to complete activities of daily living, the very dry definition of disability. I didn't have the lived experience of that treatment that I now get just from the expectations people have assembled by looking at me. And so when I became visibly disabled, when I had that overnight change in treatment, I got it. And that is a very common mechanism of empathy for people. Not getting it until you yourself have directly experienced it, or someone very closely to you has directly experienced something. And that is undeniably effective. But I have to believe there is another way, because we cannot be universal as people and have every possible experience, or even have those ones that are most important to connecting to others. So what can we do to create those connections in absentia? Is there any shortcut? Not just because it is so needed, but because it is so powerful when we do have it.
Hell fucking yes. So eruditely put. Because that's exactly what this show is about. It's about getting people... My main goal of this podcast is to get people to listen to it and in some way, shape or form get it. What makes the people who are creative different from the people who aren't creative? Well, actually the answer is nothing. It's just one person made something and the other person didn't. And by listening to this podcast, you will get it fairly quick that there is no difference, that you can just go out. If you spend 2 seconds a day just reflecting on, well, what am I grateful for? Who am I? What am I called to be? You can do it. Like, no one's, like, I'm just some random asshole that messages people on Twitter, and people let me into their mind's palace. And because with the expectation that I'm going to listen to them and give them a platform, and you can be the random asshole on Twitter. Like, you can just message people. You can just message people and it's okay. And the worst thing that's going to happen is people are going to tell you no. Whoa. So what? Just go off and do it anyway. I think I'll quote the wonderful Avery Monson here, and I was mentioning how I wanted to eventually go into narrating audiobooks. And he looked at me and he was like, you have a microphone. Do it. Blank, you just do it. Just go ahead, because there has to be a better way. This idea that something will happen to you, or you'll do a course and then you'll be a creative person. There has to be a better way. I think there is. What makes you smile?
So many things make me smile, in truth. I am familiar with scientific literature about the notion of a happiness set point, that we have sort of a homeostasis to our moods, that we might be temporarily happier or temporarily less happy based on any number of circumstances, but that eventually many of us will float back to our equilibrium. And I'm lucky in that mine is really set very high. I am a happy person by any definition, not just of circumstance, but purely of temperament. And so it allows me to take tremendous joy in all manner of things. Unquestionably, social connection is the most powerful. To be a part of the friend group that I have and a part of the community that I never thought could exist. When I started as a creature of the internet void, I was understandably apprehensive because the internet is mean in many corners. It is a dark place. Twitch has a bad reputation. I was really, truly scared of what that might bring, and was shocked by the capacity of love and generosity in those communities. Good Lord. The folks in community with me have never met a charity goal that they didn't want to take a sledgehammer to and destroy. And how could I not smile? How could I not take joy in that? Not just in this beautiful act of kindness that they do on such a regular basis, motivated by the people I am lucky enough to work and play with, but that they would bring me into such a thing and allow me to share in that joy is always, always going to make me happy.
How do you feel about death?
This year, more than many, I discovered the distinction between death in abstract and death close enough to see his face, and how that crystallizes feelings not otherwise there. I've carried no long-standing fear of it, or avoidance, or sense of impending mortality, in part because it has been so abstract, even in places where in my life it has become concrete. I lost my father when I was 11. Relatives, friends, things that absolutely make death real, but still hit so differently from the possibility of it becoming acutely personal, like individual. That death is painful for me and frightening in the abstract, but much more instinctual up close. It reminds me a little bit of stories of people who jump from a great height and feel differently the moment that gravity has taken over their decision. Death comes close, and death seems more real this year than any other from this global pandemic, and I see his face, and it is like my feet have left the ledge. I'm not a fan.
Me either. Every single time this fear grips me that, like, one day I won't exist, that I look upon everything I've done. I'm saying, is this it? Like, there's the famous look upon my works, O ye mighty, and despair. And I look upon what I've done and like the mistakes I've made, because it's always the mistakes You never look back upon your life and see a field filled with your harvests. You see the ones that never worked. You see the things you said that you regret. You see, like, situations where you are a bad person by virtue of being the victim of a situation. And I think about the fact that I could just die, and all of those feelings, that would be it. You know, there'd be nothing. I would look back and everyone, like, people would say, oh wow, she was nice, I guess, or she was fine, I guess, or there's no concreteness there. I don't think I've made some sort of impact on the people around me, besides maybe my family, in the way that I would want to, to benefit people in the way that I would like to, and make a world a better place in the way that I want to. And I don't mean to save the world. I simply just want to make people smile and have a good afternoon. And I'm just terrified. I'm just so scared all the time. But it's inevitable, and some days I have sleeps where I kind of go dancing with the face of death for a little while, where nothing seems to happen, and it's so deep and so peaceful and comfortable that I'm not afraid for the 15 or so minutes after I wake up. That my body has kind of forgotten it's supposed to be afraid, and just kind of goes, well, you weren't afraid when you didn't exist. Yes, well, I didn't have the capacity to appreciate things as well. So I don't really know how I feel about that. That's why that question exists, by the way. Because I want someone to tell me someday something that would make me not scared anymore. Like, I want someone to give me, like, to give you, spoil a little bit, because you probably might listen to B. Dave's episode after it comes out. But his answer was, if it was so bad, God wouldn't do it to all of us. And I was like, that's pretty interesting. That gave me pause. But I'm glad someone else shares my just terror.
I admit I'm perhaps more hedonistic almost about my fear of death than you, in that my lack of impact I can come comfortably to terms with, if only because I find existential meaninglessness so comforting. That no one will have an impact on a long enough scale. So how important is impact really? But there are many, many experiences I would like to have ahead of that. Just, perhaps that's selfish, but that is the origin of mine, that there are so many things I yet want to do and be and have that I'm not yet ready to give up without a fight. But the dying, I think, does suck much more than the death.
Yeah, I'm sure being dead is fine. It's just, you have to die first.
You have to get there, yeah.
Ugh.
That seems unpleasant.
Yeah.
And particularly in some manners more than others. There are some I'd really rather not.
Oh, yeah, completely. Like, whoa. This was made like a wave, so went up with the smile, down with the death, and then back up again with, tell me about something you learned recently that amused you.
So, this year during quarantine, I finally started my own personal Twitch. I've worked throughout the Twitchernet as a role-playing gamer, but I never had the much more traditional experience of Twitch of a person, a camera, a microphone, and maybe a game. So I began just a few months ago, and in my Just Chatting streams, I have a segment called May Contain Science. It was derived from a segment I did a long time ago as part of an after show for a show I did, Local News from Our Universe, where I would bring a piece of space news and recount it. So now, not space particularly, but each week I learn a new piece of science and I present it to our community because I believe very much in amateur enthusiasm about science and amateur participation in the scientific endeavor as a civic good and a societal good and as a personal good. Taking joy in science is itself fulfilling and wonderful. Science is great and cool and occasionally amusing. So 1 week ago, I learned that scientists with the British Antarctic Survey had discovered 8 new emperor penguin colonies throughout the Antarctic and confirmed 3 others that we hadn't seen since the 70s or the 80s. Overall, the known emperor penguin population increased 5 to 10% as a result of identifying these colonies, giving us roughly 500,000 total known emperor penguins. Is that what amused me? No. It's how. You see, for a very long time, these scientists identified penguins using Landsats. And each pixel of this Landsat imagery is about 30 meters, which makes it very hard to find small colonies of penguins. So we had already found the low-hanging fruit of these large colonies, large enough to find on 30-meter sized pixels. Well, about 10 years ago, they discovered a more indirect method, and with high-resolution imagery, have been able to leverage it to find even smaller colonies. Because you might not find the penguins themselves, but you know what you can see on those images? Poop. Changes in color from guano stains on sea ice. You can use them to track the penguins, and because that itself is longitudinal over time, you're going to have an easier time finding them. So it turns out, you know what I've learned that amuses me? We find penguins by poop. We look from space with absurdly powerful satellite imagery that now can find things not just 30 meters, but as small as 30 centimeters. So we need heuristics to help guide, and so we're not combing the Antarctic foot by foot. And what do we use? Poop. Visible from space.
What is beautiful?
What is beautiful is itself a separate question from what is beauty, and therefore what is beautiful implies what I find beautiful, not something necessarily ontologically beautiful that I might have to defend in some sense. And so I would put forth what is beautiful is what you can find so. And one can have a very restricted aesthetic that finds only a few things beautiful, but that seems so limiting to me. That if you can find a more expansive eye for what is beautiful, you will be rewarded by seeing more beauty in the world. That you will simply see more and see better, perhaps, for finding beauty, for challenging yourself not to fight convention for its own sake or rejecting conventional beauty, but simply to have a more expanded eye is itself good. That is a challenge for some, but one well worth it. It is part of looking to like if looking liking a movie.
Would you describe yourself as cute and cuddly?
Yes, I would describe myself as both cute and cuddly. And in times when I am not, it is solely in reaction to that quite accurate first perception that if someone perceives me as being made of knives, it is because I have consciously cultivated that, because at times we must be made of knives. Or to be taken seriously because somehow there's this mistaken assumption that one cannot be both. And yet, I do exist in paradox and thereby can be cute, cuddly, and perhaps occasionally made of knives, but I reject the notion that I ought not be taken seriously because I am cute. And I think scratching that particular scratch and sniff quickly reveals that there's misogyny baked into the dichotomy of cuteness and seriousness. That it is unnecessarily trivializing. And so to exist in that contradiction is to reject the dichotomy. I am cute and also made of knives.
Where do you feel safest?
I feel safest at the table for role-playing games. In an industry that does very much focus on safety tools, in part because safety is so precious where it's had, and the emotional vulnerability required of deep role-playing makes it so destructive in its absence. But what I have discovered is that you can't really fully hide who you are at the table. It comes through in 1,000 little ways, maybe from the hours spent together, and maybe from the fact that ultimately you're improvising your character and that has to come from something. And your interactions with your table mates reveals your generosity of spirit, among many other things. And so a long-time table where we've all served together, in a sense, is one that has seen you. And to continue playing at that table is to be among people who have seen you and accept you. And that, for me, is the sort of emotional safety that can't be paralleled, where in any variety of circumstances, I will feel safest if I am not only accepted, but feel like I couldn't hide who I am and am accepted. That there's the kind of acceptance of run through a VPN of imposter syndrome, where they only accept me because they don't really know me. If they only knew. And so, to be in that circumstance where you cannot hide who you are, and still to be accepted, shatters that layer of self-doubt in a way that allows one to be truly vulnerable and go unhurt, and thereby to feel safe.
If you were on a starship, what position would you hold?
That question is much less abstract for me than for many. I have, in my role-playing career, served on a disproportionate number of starships, and am in fact serving right now. One of the shows I play is Clear Skies, which is a Star Trek RPG, and on that show, I play the captain. It was a position that I long avoided, in part because I was so cognizant of the responsibility. A ranking structure is always particularly delicate at a table because as players we are equal, though our characters are not. And so responsible use of and interaction of authority in a place where actual authority among players does not exist is a delicate dance by consensus. That character only has authority because players will support it. so that their characters uphold those relative status positions. And so, as captain, you really have a tremendous obligation to play in ways that are responsible to that. And frankly, I don't think that changes in positions of real authority. There's, at the risk of quoting Game of Thrones, power resides where men believe it resides. And that's true of characters on a starship, but it's equally true anywhere where authority might exist. It is always, in some way, a product of perception. Of all of the positions on a starship, captain is stressful, but rewarding. It is not in any way about wielding power over others. For me, it isn't even really about being the person with the agency to make the decisions. In fact, it is about shepherding a ship full of dreams. The ones of the science officer, of the engineers, of all of the aspirations, all of the goals, all of the needs, all of the wants of all of those crew under your protection and who are your responsibility. That if you're captain of a starship, you serve your crew far more than your crew serves you. And I'm here for that. It took a long time to get there. But I'm a very happy captain of the USS Ross.
What is a feeling or experience you've had which doesn't have a word that you wish did?
I alluded to this very notion. The closest is Zoom joy. The feeling of delight and desire for speed and the euphoria that comes uniquely with going fast. Ideally fast in a way that you have some control beyond the abstract foot to pedal, though I think many racers also feel Zoom joy. But there is something about fast and the frisson from that. Zoom joy.
Do you think there is more good than bad in the world?
Individual people ourselves have such a limited vantage point of the world. We are the people who only have our hands upon one part of the elephant and can never fully understand the state of said pachyderm, and rely, therefore, on testimony of news that itself is filtered by view count, by interest, by a culture of what is considered newsworthiness that makes it almost impossible to really get a picture of what is going on in the world. So the closest I can look then is at what I see from my vantage point, in my microcosm, and do my best to extrapolate that out, taking into account, yes, that which I have learned from news of places far beyond me, but likewise taking into account the biases with that, because just as my mundane experience of life is not reflected in the news, that's equally true of the rest of the world, I can only assume. So, if I look around me, I see, yes, the banality of evil, but equally and underreported, the good things people do for each other on a purely personal level. That if we spoke before about the challenge of empathy that becomes exponentially more difficult across distance and across a gulf of experiences, empathy and generosity are incredibly tight when close, like magnets. And seeing that, I know that that experience can't be unique. The people around me are not somehow uniquely virtuous to the exclusion of others. And so I assume that most people have communities that look something like mine, that have closed-mindedness and prejudice and hatred and fear that turns one inward and becomes protective and puts out spikes to prevent the ones closest to one being harmed. Whether that is family or whether that is self, from which so much evil, if you will, springs from holding close to try to protect what one has, to remain an imperator rather than attempt to save wives who have been in a circumstance you were not too long ago. And equally, there are so many people constantly going beyond that and constantly seeking connection and seeking self-improvement and doing where they can. That if game design and game rules and structure facilitate certain sorts of interaction where some rules might create hostility, some rules might facilitate connection, that's equally true of society and in creating systems that make it easier for people to do good, people do. That means I have hope not just for the potential of good, but there is enough in system now. Perhaps too local, yes, but still there. That I know has to be everywhere. Is there more good than evil in the world? I can't count it, because by the time I finish, I go back to the beginning and it has already changed. But there is so much goodness that has surprised me that I have to assume there's more than I might expect on first glance. Perhaps more than evil.
If you could give just one piece of advice, what would that be?
Always do the bad idea. It's a thing that's become almost cliche for me at the role-playing table, that if there's an opportunity to do something that might be too dangerous, I understand that as the strong story choice, that making bold choices moves a story forward. But I don't think that's any less true of life. That it is worth doing the thing that feels too bold, the thing that scares you, the thing that you aren't fully confident will work. Because if it doesn't, you fail. Okay. The world will keep turning. You will learn from the failure. You will grow. There is so much pressure on perfection that can be so easily shattered by failure, that it makes us fear boldness, that it makes us fear pursuing things that matter so much to us that we are afraid to even try, because what if we fail? We've learned that failure is not destructive. So, if the downside isn't down, do it. Be bold. Do the bad idea, the thing that scares you, the bigger choice. Because it's all upside from here. And if you stack enough bad ideas on top of each other, they might just become a good idea.